Hello and welcome to Tsaá with Roma. Today I am with editor and director of Nine Arches Press, Jane Commane. Hi Jane.
Hi Roma, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. And thank you for coming on Tsaá. How are you?
Oh, I'm good, thanks. Yeah, I'm good. I've got my cup here as well, full of tea. So, um,
Yes, of course.
I'm all
What are
ready.
you drinking, Jane?
I've got a Lady Grey, so it's a little bit kind of zesty and botanical, which is quite nice. So.
Oh, I've never heard of Lady Grey. I've always had Earl Grey. Is that different? Different from Earl?
It it's just got a little bit of lemon and or orange in it. So, in fact, it was bought for me by a poet. It was Jennifer Wong sent me some lovely tea
Oh,
bags
Jennifer! Oh, Jennifer
with
is so sweet. Hi,
yeah.
Jennifer. She's so sweet, and she's such an incredible poet.
Yeah, she is. She is, and has fantastic taste in tea as well.
But yes, thank you again for coming on. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the start of Nine Arches Press.
Thinking around about 2008, just a consciousness. I've been working for Heaven Tree Press in Coventry, and there seem to be lots of really talented voices out there. So, Under the Radar magazine actually began as a way of platforming some of the talented voices in our region and sort of grew to also take on short fiction and reviews and to be a little bit more about kind of platforming all kinds of new writers. And the point of the magazine has always been to create something readable and enjoyable for our audience, for our readership, where hopefully they make discoveries of new writers that they will love as well. But also in terms of mixing things, that you could have really well established writers alongside very new, up and coming or emerging writers. And to have that kind of breadth of work within the magazine felt really important, that you could literally be publishing for the first time and rubbing shoulders with somebody who's had, say, 4 or 5 collections from a major publisher at the same time. So publishing somebody like Penelope Shuttle, for instance, who's being published by Blood Axe and has some, a really wonderful sort of back catalogue of poetry, alongside poets who are brand new and it's their first time in print. So that always seems to be quite an important guiding principle.
Mm.
Um, and the press sort of began from a small amount of money I had from working self-employed for the publisher in Coventry, and I sort of got a couple of issues of the magazine out of it, and then decided to do pamphlets. So we did a couple of pamphlets, and about 2 or 3 pamphlets in, we had a collection by one by Tom Chivers and one by the Birmingham poet David Hart, and we produced them slightly differently with beautiful kind of covers and nicely designed, and they actually got on the Michael Marks shortlist for that year, which was phenomenal. That felt like a big thing.
Oh, yes, of course, yeah. Than 3 years into publishing. And it was very interesting how you said you started because you wanted to illuminate the local voices of Coventry or perhaps the Midlands. But you are a poet yourself before Nine Arches Press. How was it for a poet to also run a publishing company, but also to be an editor? Because being a poet and an editor are two different jobs, really.
That's a really good question, and I think when I, sort of around the start of Nine Arches, I felt that editing and being a poetry editor would be a really good way of kind of keeping my hand in with my own poetry in a way. And I think I'd not long finished my MA. I was worried about, and I'd studied writing, and I was sort of worried about losing contact with that world, with the world of writing, with the world of poetry, with the world of creativity. And I had a day job, and I sort of felt a bit worried that if I didn't have something that involved me somehow with poetry in my life, that poetry might risk becoming something distant that I once did, and I didn't
Mm.
want that to happen. So publishing was a way of staying connected to the world of poetry. And the interesting thing is, I think I was under the illusion that being a publisher would really, sort of give me lots of time to write, which actually
Mm.
publishing is a wonderful thing, but it does really take over every part of your life, especially when you're a sort of indie publisher. And I know lots of people who run indie presses will absolutely understand this. That the minute you start running it, it takes over a little room, maybe a desk in your house, and before you know it, you've got boxes of books underneath the stairs or in cupboards, and you sort of become quite sort of independent in terms of taking things to book fairs, and you
Mm,
become part of this whole incredible world of
mm,
independent publishing, which is really flourishing and exciting. And I can remember the first couple of times going to things like States of Independence in Leicester and other places. So you kind of become, sort of part of all of this kind of ecosystem of publishing and writing
mm,
and creating. Um, and in many ways, it has, I have to say, yes, the time that I probably have committed to being a publisher has perhaps been, at times it is a big commitment. So it has been perhaps detrimental. I probably would have written more. But then I don't think I would necessarily have become, I think being an editor makes you work quite hard at being a poet as well, because
mm,
not only you're aware and frequently in awe of the incredible things that people write and the ways in which people are approaching poetry, you're very in touch with
mm,
that. You're also sort of, I always think if you are an editor, part of your job is frequently to sort of ask questions and seek to help writers realize fully what their vision is for their writing. And sometimes that can involve, like, quite challenging or sort of important conversations about their work. And I think if you hold other writers to those same standards, you can't not do that for yourself. So you have to be quite tough on yourself as a writer, as a self-editor. So probably you have to let go of some of those illusions a little bit. You can't be precious, certainly. I mean, once you've edited a certain number of other writers, you can no longer, in all honesty, be precious about your own work, I don't think.
Wow, there's a lot there because you're saying that you went into publishing to remain in the publishing world or in the literary scene as a writer, but also having done that and having helped other people as a writer, it has taken something away from you as well, which is your time. And sometimes there's just so much effort that you put into publishing and cannot focus on your own work as much as you want. And I could really agree with that with Harana Poetry. I mean, Harana is only an online magazine, and we make really small number of poets each issue, and it's such a um hard thing to read through all the submissions and select and do the admin. Thankfully Kostya's really good with the admin. He's really doing all the admin. I could really relate to that difficulty. Since you're talking about looking at other people's work and exploring them, learning how to ask questions, learning how to support the writer, I wonder if that journey also helped you as a writer, sifting through all the submissions and seeing other people's way of crafting poems.
Yeah, it's a really, you do read an enormous range of work. You learn, I think it's a little bit like having a Haynes manual for poetry. Not that I think you can reduce poetry to the nuts and bolts necessarily, but certainly in terms of technical things, you
Mm,
learn an awful lot about what happens when you take a poem apart and lay out all the little bits and see
mm,
how it fits back together, and you start paying attention to the micro details of things. So what is this line break doing? What is this full stop doing? When you're at that kind of microscopic level that you have to be as an editor, where you really, and this is why, as you know, I like to also do several passes of a manuscript or a collection or even of a
mm,
single poem, because I think you come to it at different points, noticing different things, and like you can do those big bold edits, but then the subtle things that you'll come back to, that you'll tweak, that are about literally, do I take this comma in or out of a
yes.
particular line? Do I break it here? Those very subtle but very important things, you really do develop an attention to, which I think is a huge value as an editor and as a writer. And it's one of the big things you learn is, um, and also you learn beyond the technical what the soul of a poem is. And I think that's quite important also, that sometimes technically imperfect poems can have enormous soul, and
Mm.
your job is, and that's not to edit that out.
We're talking about the soul, but also the importance of the technicalities. What is this writer trying to do with line breaks or spaces or comma, etc.? How do you sift through like a massive chunk of submission? What kind of poems speak to you, or what kind of poems make you say, "Yes, I'm gonna take this"? and say no to other, maybe other incredible poems there, but I have to say yes to this?
Oh, that's a really good question. And actually, during the last 18 months with the pandemic, we've been receiving such a high volume. I don't know if you found this with Harana, but much higher than previous times. So certainly there's a lot of people writing and a lot of people submitting. The last couple of times we've had 450 to 500 each time. So,
Wow.
and that's been fairly regular throughout pretty much since 2020. That's been a fairly regular amount to get.
Yeah.
And we tend to publish quite a few because we do publish sort of 35 to 40 poets per issue. So you do have quite a reasonable number of writers, so quite a high ratio that do get
Yeah.
published. So in terms of sorting that, that's obviously quite a lot to read and quite a lot to sort through. So I think when I get down to the final, so like the last 80, the last 100, so you've sorted out all the ones that just aren't quite at the right stage, or that, you know, the quality isn't quite where it needs to be, or they're good, they're doing something interesting, but they're just not quite. Those ones are perhaps easier to sort through. But then when you get down to that last set, the ones that are really strong, that can be really hard. And I think sometimes it's a question of thinking, you know, how original is this? Does this poem strike me? Sometimes they can be technically very good, but if the ideas or the images are not quite as original as they could be, or sometimes it's too long, and could do with a bit more editing to really find the heart of the poem. And again, I feel the same about manuscripts sometimes, that sense of the writer being present with you. I love reading
Mm.
poems where I get a real sense of voice and presence from the work. That is what really strikes me.
This is really interesting because when you did this manuscript, sorry, industry talk during the Jerwood Arvan back in 2018 in London, you did mention about the voice as well. That's a strong sense of voice. There are so many writers who will be watching this episode who would want to get published, but how do you know that there's this strong sense of voice? Or how do we strengthen that?
The question, I think, that vexes writers a fair amount, really. And I think sometimes we're thrown off by that idea of finding your voice, like
Mm,
somehow it's hiding and we have to kind of creep up on it and capture it, or
mm,
sometimes that there's a particular voice we should be adopting or, you know, using in our work. That can be actually a really difficult and not a great, always a useful piece of advice, because I think we contain multiple voices sometimes, and
mm,
we contain many things as writers that will serve us in different ways at different points. So I guess more what I say is, in sort of a sense of a strong voice, is a sense that the writer trusts the unique voice they have, and they're not necessarily trying to sound like other writers. They're trusting
mm,
that their own ideas, their unique way of seeing something, their unique way of saying something, their unique way of phrasing, or even their way of, if it's a poet that perhaps works in performance also, that sense of breathing and of delivery is in the work
mm.
somehow sometimes also. So I guess, yeah, just trust in instinct, that instinctively the writer seems to know this is theirs. And so that's a very hard one to answer, how we know when we have that.
Yes, but you're saying something really important in a way that it's easy to follow or be inspired or be pulled by the voices of other writers, especially if those writers are successful and maybe you idolize them. It's easy to do that, but sometimes we have to, well, most of the time you have to trust in the way you phrase things. So how do you nurture your poets in that way? Have you experienced working with a certain poet perhaps, and really nurture the voice of that poet?
Yeah, I think in some ways with all writers, what you're doing sometimes when you're editing is you're spotting the bits that perhaps they themselves at a deeper level, perhaps sometimes when you edit, people say, you know, I knew there was something wrong with this poem, and
Mm,
now we've looked at that line, I know entirely what I'm trying to do isn't quite working, or I'm not really quite invested in this line somehow. I've put it in, or I've put this idea in, and I'm trying so hard to make it work, but actually I'm going to let it go. And I think sometimes that is also about that sense of we try lots of things in poems, and that's a really positive, important thing actually. And sometimes we're trying different things on to work out what works and what doesn't. And sometimes it's about sort of working out, okay, that didn't really quite work, or that didn't quite feel right for me as a
Mm.
style of writing or a way of approaching something. So I'm going to try something else. And part of that is about also experiencing what our voice is capable of and always pushing it a little bit. So we are pushing it. We don't want to just stay stuck in a groove of, oh, this is my voice and this is how I write and I must always write in this way. But it's actually about gently pushing out the boundaries that also, and that thing about reading other writers and their
Mm.
influence, I think it's really important to have lots of influences because,
Mm.
and read widely, because then you don't just have one or two key influences who, sometimes you can
Yes.
tell those early stage writers who they have found a writer they absolutely adore, and they've absorbed their style and approach to the extent where that becomes how they always approach everything. And we all
Mm.
start in that way. So there's nothing wrong in that. But once you read a bit more widely and trust your own voice to be strong enough, and a lot of it is trust,
Yeah.
that can really alter how you write. So yeah, I think a lot of those experiences as an editor is sometimes asking the question, identifying the poems that are less strong because perhaps the writer has tried something and it's not quite worked, or
Mm.
it's sort of may even be pointing towards a future direction that they're not quite ready to be at the arrival point for almost. But that's not to say that it's a failure. I think everything you try, it feeds into your work whether it succeeds or fails because you learn
Mm.
something from it.
Yes, it will always be there, and maybe at one point in the future, when the time is right, and you know how to write towards that thing that you're writing. You look at manuscripts. So I assume there are also a lot of manuscript submissions that Nine Arches Press are having, especially nowadays. Your independent press is so successful. You have so many shortlisted in really nice prices.
Aside from the strong voice, I think I look for collections that are that have perhaps not necessarily, they don't have to be really structured and completely themed, but there has to
Mm.
be an awareness of something holding the poems together. So rather than, here's sort of 40 slightly random poems that don't really work together as a whole, there's a sense that the writer's thought about it as a collection.
Mm.
And I think part of that for me is that I also try to always be that bridge between a reader and a writer. I think an editor's job is to be in that position, really. So I'm also thinking, what what are readers interested in reading? What haven't they read before? So, like Daniel's book is a really, a great example of an extraordinary book that I can't think of anything comparable at this point.
Mm.
There are similarities or perhaps approaches that you could, sort of find as influences, but there's no one book that quite does what that book does. And
Mm.
equally, Cynthia Miller's collection on honorifics, and
Mm.
Jane Burns' book Be Feared, that was published this year. Caleb Parkin with his brilliant queer eco
Yes.
disco approach to writing about eco poetry and nature. All of these collections are, for me, sort of seeking to sometimes approach subjects that have been written about before, but they're so unique in how they do it. So I think I'm
Mm.
always attracted by a unique approach, even if the ideas like eco poetry, are something we're quite used to. It's always wonderful to read a writer who's sort of taking an interesting slant on those things. And um, I also like to think about what readers aren't seeing on their shelves. So if there's a writer who is writing about a subject that perhaps poetry isn't necessarily always picking up on, that can be really interesting, I think. And I think also for readers, they are interested in topics from, everything from autism through to and neurodivergent identities, right through to things like writing about art, or writing about particular types of insects or particular types of
Mm.
wildflower or Alzheimer's. We've had poetry collections that focus on all of these topics in a variety of ways. So for me, it's sort of thinking, well, readers are interested in lots of things, and they're interested in history, they're interested in the here and now. How do we bring more readers to poetry? How do
Yeah.
we, attract more people to read poetry? How to express to
Yes.
them that this book might be something you want to read because it's on this topic. It's,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. So one of the question is, would this manuscript be able to open the gate of poetry wider to invite different kinds of readers in or more readers in? If there is a poet who's working on a manuscript, what would be your advice to them in order to get that manuscript published?
I think it's really good to test your manuscript out. And by that, I mean, make sure that you're sending poems out to magazines. Um, have a read of magazines as well and work out what their individual style or preferences or approaches are, because all magazines have, sort of a sort of field of interest, I think. So pitching your work well also helps you to work out which kind of publishers then are most likely to want to take your work.
Mm.
One really good tip for doing that is, if there are writers you admire, um, and whose work you feel you may be within a similar kind of area of interest, again, have a look at the back, have a look at where they've sent, which magazines they've sent work to, who's published them. That can be a really useful guide. I think what that does is allow you to test your work. It also allows you to build an audience, because publishers will want to know that you've spent some time attempting to reach a readership and spent some time maybe being involved in poetry as a living art form. So that can be really useful. Also testing your work out in other ways, like, if you're able to join a stanza group or a feedback group, sometimes that can be useful. Sometimes workshops can be useful to kind of, again, press out those boundaries of your work. So things like poetry school, Arvon at home, festivals, they can all be really useful. So I guess immersing yourself as much as you can in poetry, and again, that reading widely, so roughly sort of where you would place yourself as a writer, but also you have an awareness of what's going on around you, of who your
Mm.
peers are, who's writing, and also feeling free to enjoy or not enjoy stuff. Because I think so often in poetry, when you're quite new or when you're starting out, you feel quite worried about having to like everything, and it can feel like a real pressure that you have to. There's something wrong with me because I didn't enjoy this poem in poetry review. Or there's something wrong with me because I love this
Yeah.
poem and it feels underappreciated, or I really enjoyed this
Mm.
book. Sometimes we feel like it's a failure for us as a reader, and I think it's really
Mm.
important that readers know, and emerging writers know too, that it's
Mm.
okay. Take your time. You may come back to it in 3 years and absolutely love that poem that you didn't understand or didn't feel you quite clicked with. It's a process sometimes, and sometimes you'll come back to it in 3 years, think, no, I was right, I still don't like it. It's not my kind of
And
thing. But
that's fine
then,
as well,
yeah,
isn't it?
keeping a bit of a healthy distance and
Mm.
not letting it become something you feel stressed or worried or anxious about, because I
Yeah.
encounter that quite often in writers who are emerging, and I worry about how that's detrimental to their creativity a bit.
Yeah. Just if like you have to write in a certain way, again going back to finding your voice or trusting in your voice. It's as if some maybe feeling that they have to write in a certain way to be accepted or to be to be seen in the landscape. You do support a lot of emerging writers, not only in the area but nationally as well, with your Dynamo and Primers mentoring schemes. Can you talk to us a little bit more about those two?
Yeah, of course. So Dynamo, Romulan, you were in our first ever wave of Dynamo poets.
Jane, do you remember our goal planning on Dynamo? I was like,
I
Jane,
do.
can you put on your goal planning? I'm going to be shortlisted in the forward, and then I didn't get shortlisted. Jane has been really supportive during our Dynamo.
Dynamo is very much aimed at the West Midlands. It's aimed at poets, and it's aimed at poets who traditionally haven't been as well represented within publishing as they should have been. And the idea is to offer a sort of behind the scenes support, really, the kind of editing support and the kind of career support that helps writers to identify what it is they're doing, what it is they need to get to the next stage, and ultimately that planning is about looking at the next year, the next 3 years, the next 5 years, where you want to be as a writer. And that kind of level of planning can just be really useful in being very honest about what you want.
I think that's one of the most important thing that I've learned as well from Dynamo. You have taught me to aim high, because at the end of the day, even if you don't get those high aims, and sometimes it's okay. You don't, sometimes we don't always get what we want. But just by working through that journey, you develop anyway. You develop so massively. So you might as well aim high.
It's also having the things then that even if you don't attain that thing you wanted to attain in year one, there's a moment of of hopefully also finding the things that will help you continue and sustain what you're doing, making connections with other organisations and funding. So there's quite a lot of practical support around Dynamo in terms of what it offers mentees, in terms of where are you at, what do you want to achieve, and what kind of things do you need practically to help you achieve those things. So that's been very much kind of quite a big part of that scheme. And the last wave were quite a lot of Coventry writers, and it was brilliant seeing some of those then come through and perform at Contain Strong Language for the BBC Festival that
Yes,
we
of
were part
course.
of
Yeah.
back in September.
Is Dynamo repeating again? So are you going to recruit more Dynamo mentees?
Our aim is ultimately to create a really big cohort, 40, 50 or so poets who are all part of it. And our next round should open in 2022, and we'll be recruiting the next 8 or so poets as part of that. So
That's such a gift to the West Midland poets. Can you talk to us as well about Primers? Primers is another mentoring scheme from Nine Arches Press.
it is. So Primers, again, sort of aims to find interesting new voices in poetry at a slightly different stage to perhaps Dynamo. So maybe the next stage on, where the writers have a sort of set of poems that have really come together and they're looking to publish them. Now, it kind of came out of a conversation that I'd had with poet Maria Taylor about we've stopped publishing pamphlets at this time, and we sort of had a conversation about would Nine Arches ever publish pamphlets again. And I'd sort of made the decision not to, partly because I felt pamphlets are hard to place in bookshops and not impossible to sell, but certainly more of a challenge to sell higher volumes and to get trade distribution on. But also that sometimes there were writers that I wanted to see spend a bit more time bringing together a full collection rather than a pamphlet. And I just felt that the future of Nine Arches laid more with full collections, really. But it seemed a shame to miss out that step that was between Under the Radar and a full collection somehow. So what it kind of was about, I guess, was really about bridging that gap. And then I had a conversation with Poetry School about, they were in a similar situation of kind of looking at ways of supporting writers at that point, that, they were at this stepping off point. They don't have a full collection yet, but their voices are really interesting. How do you introduce them to readers? And quite often that step to a full collection does require that little bit of previous introduction to a readership, and pamphlets perform that really well. But we wanted to do something a bit different. It was like a little kind of a bit like those Penguin Modern Poets volumes with 3 or 4 poets in one collection. We really wanted to do something that would introduce new voices. So the scheme was developed with Poetry School, and every year we had a different tutor mentor. So first year we had Catherine Maris, we've had Jacob Summer Rose, we've had Hannah Lowe, Kim Moore, Jacqueline Safra. This year's is Rashid Astadar. And Rishi's currently working with our 3 newest Primers poets. And what the process involves really is it's about developing a set of maybe 20 or so poems into a selection that go into the book, which we'll publish next year. We also provide events and sort of celebration publicity around their work. And it's a way really of showcasing those writers at a really vital step when we think, a little bit more sort of mentoring support for these writers is really critical.
And you have introduced a lot of new voices throughout the years with Primers. And what I like as well about Primers, it's like I'm I'm doing everything that Nine Arches Press is offering, Dynamo, then Primers. But what I really like about it as well, Jane, is your support never ends. Even though the Primers mentoring scheme has ended, for me, your support has always been there still. Thank you for treating me as a part of your Nine Arches Press family.
Oh, my pleasure. It's always been such a delight to see your poetry taking flight, Romlin. And you've got, we were just talking earlier about the wonderful new essay you've got in Why I Write Poetry, which is just a stunning piece of writing. I'm really looking forward to what you do with your non-fiction as well. You're just
Thank you.
writing some fantastic things at the minute. It's just a real pleasure to see you
Thank
doing
you. Things that you've said that would help us to get published. One is developing your voice and the writer's strong voice. The second one is your ideas have to be solid, that somehow in your manuscript you kind of know what you're doing, or you have an idea of where you're taking the manuscript, and also that the writer's presence is solid, that when you're reading the manuscript it's as if you could really see a three-dimensional persona of this speaker. Thank you so much for those tips, Jane. That's been really helpful, and thank you again for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been lovely being part of this, and I've just really enjoyed having a chance to have a cup of tea with you, Romlin, even virtually.
Yes, and hopefully next time it's going to be in person.